Well, thank you all so much, and thank you, Freeport Historical Society, for the invitation to be here tonight. It's a real pleasure. My name is Kate McMahon. I am museum specialist at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I am from Maine. I have a bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of Southern Maine and a PhD in history from Howard University in Washington, D.C. And my research primarily focuses on the global slave trade. But I've also done a fair amount of research for my master's thesis on the community of Peterborough in Warren, as well as other African-American communities in Maine, such as Malaga Island. But tonight I'm going to talk about Maine and global slavery. And I apologize for if you hear my barking dogs in the background. The realities of Zooming from home. I'm going to start tonight with just a brief overview of global slavery and the scope of global slavery and the global slave trades in particular. Slavery has touched every continent in some way or another. Even places that did not have captive Africans that were toiling there are shaped in some ways by the forces that shaped the global slave trade and therefore the Industrial Revolution, as well as our broad capitalistic economy. It had an immense human toll. This batch of information you see here on the right is from slavevoyages.org, which I am a member of the operational committee of. It is the largest database that records the history of the transatlantic slave trade. So far, there are about 45,000 voyages that are captured. And this is the total numbers of people that were transported from Africa to the Americas and the countries that they were transported by. So you see about 12.5 million people were embarked from Africa, but only about 10.7 million people actually arrived in the New World, which is a difference of about 1.8 million people, or a mortality rate of 14.5% for the totality of the slave trade. We don't truly know, and we will never know, the true scope of the numbers of people that died. Once an enslaved person ended up on the coast, they had previously been on a much longer journey from the interior of Africa, usually along major rivers, but coming from smaller rivers into more major rivers. And millions of untold people died during that part of the enslavement experience. So we truly will not know the full scope of slavery in the world, but this gives us an idea of where we're starting from. And you can see that Brazil in particular, Portugal transported the vast majority of enslaved people out of Africa, almost 6 million enslaved people of the total of 12 million to the Americas, primarily Brazil, but they also transported them to other Portuguese colonies. So we have, coinciding with the beginnings of transatlantic slavery around 1500, we have the quote unquote discovery of the New World by Europeans, and the development happening at the same time of technologies of shipbuilding, which of course I'll talk a little bit about shipbuilding today, that allowed vessels to traverse the difficult windward coast of Africa, as well as the jet stream, and making the passage to the Americas, as well as along the coast of Africa. So this gives us an idea of global slavery, but what does that mean for Maine and the rest of New England? And so it has proven difficult to do research on Maine and the legal period of the slave trade. And there are a few reasons why this is. Number one, there's a lack of research. and work that I'm doing, as well as other scholars and members of Atlantic Black Box, which you can learn more about by going to atlanticblackbox.com, are beginning to look at the ways in which New England was involved in the slave trade in all levels, as well as global slavery and complicity with enslavement. We also have a general misunderstanding of what the slave trade is. I would say the vast majority of people, when they think of a slave ship, they think that a slave ship was only ever a slave ship. And that's just not simply the case. Vessels transported enslaved people on one journey and may have transported cargo on a, sugar or cotton or wood on another journey. They were merchant ships first, and often enslaved people were transported alongside traditional cargo. So there are collaborative projects in the work like Slave Voyages that are beginning to look at that totality of what our maritime history is, and no longer divorce it from the history of slavery, but actually understand that slavery and the slave trade were integral parts of maritime and global history, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, especially. Another problem is that we have archives that are hidden or just heavily dispersed or have been destroyed. We have gaps, and we also have, archives that exist that people have not looked at with these critical questions of slavery and its legacies in mind. So new work is being done to uncover this and re-examine these archives, but there still needs to be a lot more work done. And then finally, another issue we have in understanding this is the fact that there is not anywhere in the state of Maine, for example, where you could get a higher degree in history with a focus on the history of slavery or the slave trade. So, that is pretty much the same throughout Northern New England, except at elite universities, at some elite universities like Harvard University, which do specific work on slavery. We just do not have the support in the universities to invest in scholars of color, scholars who are researching this type of history. So hopefully that will begin to change as we are living in this post-COVID, post-George Floyd world. But what we do know about the slave trade in Maine is that there was at least a colonial market for enslaved people in York by 1650. We only have a small amount of evidence for the slave trade prior to the 19th century. But prior to the American Revolution, Massachusetts, which obviously included Maine, citizens had made 2 attempts to stop the trade in enslaved Africans, but they were not favored by the colonial governor of Massachusetts, and therefore these attempts went nowhere. Rhode Island and Connecticut did pass resolutions barring the importation of enslaved Africans into those states, but none of the colonial powers made any real attempts at limiting the engagement of their citizens in the traffic in enslaved Africans elsewhere, outside of the United States, particularly to the Caribbean, which is vital to New England's economy. It was not until 1787 that Rhode Island passed the first law barring the participation of its citizens in the slave trade, which levied a 1,000 pound fine for fitting out the vessel and an additional 100 pounds per captive. So Massachusetts and Connecticut then followed with similar legislation in 1788. However, as Elizabeth Donnan, who is an important scholar of the slave trade, notes, quote, "The legislative situation was confused by questions of jurisdiction and constitutionality, all of which tended to aid the slave trader and to increase the zeal of abolitionists for federal rather than state action." And of course, we see these same issues play out in our politics today over whether something should be taken care of at the federal level or the state level. So On the screen are a few examples um, of particular vessels that we do know were engaged in the slave trade. One, the Betsy of Kittery, arrived in June of 1752 with an unknown number of enslaved people on board. It says boys and girls. We don't know what ages they were. The average age of an enslaved person on a slave ship was at times 13 years old, because they were considered to be the prime, going into their prime working age, their prime health. So it is likely that many of these people were children. But regardless, we do know that a number of other vessels prior to 1808 were transporting enslaved people to other locations in the United States, in the Americas. So similar to in the same line, in 1791, Thomas Hodges had, who was a merchant from a ship captain rather from Portland, purchased enslaved people in Africa with the intention of selling them in Lakai, Haiti. And Hodges and the vessels, sorry, Hodges was the merchant and Skinner is the captain, decided to stop in Havana on their return to sell the enslaved people, as the port had recently been opened up to trade and they could make a significantly larger profit for selling people there versus in other places in the Caribbean. But Americans were not allowed to sell enslaved people in the French colonies. So in order to bypass this, at the behest of the vessel's owner, Thomas Robeson, who is a quite well-known rum merchant from the city of Portland, they transferred 29 enslaved people into a French vessel in Lakai, the La Jarime, and sold the enslaved people there for a large profit. And this document on the left is part of a collection of documents that's at the Maine Historical Society about this incident. Upon the discovery of this, American authorities arrested Hodges and Skinner and took them to court in 1792, and they were each subsequently found guilty and fined for having violated this 1788 Act. But Elizabeth Donnan again argues that merchants like Robeson, nearly immediately after the American Revolution, began trading in enslaved people in larger numbers. She said, quote, remembering the profits of earlier days, so prior to the revolution, merchants whose fortunes had been shattered by war might well look to the slave traffic to restore their vanished estates. Captains and seamen so habituated to the commerce in blacks that it offended no offense to conscience were still available. So, you know, Mainers were engaged in this for a long period of time. So in 1807, Great Britain abolished the importation of enslaved people, the transportation of enslaved people. And in 1808, the United States did the same, as well as abolish the importation of enslaved Africans to the United States. This did not end the domestic slave trade, which I will talk about later, which was the trade in enslaved people in the United States, primarily from the upper South to the lower South. Some ships did still land in the United States. The most famous is the Clotilda, which was built by two Mainers, a man named Timothy Maher and his brother, who were living in Mobile, Alabama, and bet that they could bring a load of enslaved Africans into Mobile Bay, and they successfully did so in 1862. But the numbers of enslaved people that were brought directly into the United States pales in comparison to the numbers of enslaved people that were transported aboard American vessels to other places in the world, primarily during the period that I research, the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, that is to Brazil and then Cuba. And there's a number of reasons for this, which I'll talk a little bit about more, but it has pretty much everything to do with market pressures around the production of sugar, as well as abolitionism happening in these different places, and resistance as well as disease. But essentially what happens in the 18 teens is this law does almost nothing to stop Americans from participating in the trade, and it continues to climb. It's not as well documented during this period, but there is absolutely a really intense trade happening in the intra-American colonies. So between the various Caribbean islands and the United States, which was illegal in many instances. But what ends up happening is some laws are passed in the 18 teens, increasing the penalties for Americans caught participating in the trade. And in 1820, they finally make it an act of piracy and something that could be punished by death. But unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, but no one ever really is held up to that standard except for Nathaniel Gordon in 1862. Nathaniel Gordon was from Portland. He was a Portland ship captain who was captain of a vessel that was built in Kittery called the Erie. And he was convicted of transporting over 900 enslaved people to Cuba in the late 1850s and was hanged at the behest of Abraham Lincoln. But his hanging was happening in obviously a very particular political moment in the United States. And this was Lincoln's, so this is happening during the Civil War. This was one of the ways Lincoln wanted to finally suppress Americans participating in the slave trade, especially to Cuba, because it was at such a fevered pitch during this time period. So slavery and the slave trade are really building blocks of the New England economy. And here I've done some basic math. Essentially, Maine's the value of our slave fleet, you can see here on the right, is over $151 million per year profit alone. And the net profit per owner tended to average at $3.1 million that was flowing back to New England. So the total value of the slave fleet, as estimated by the New York Times in 1857, I believe, was the equivalent of $332 million or $11 million in that time. So if we look at on the left side of the screen, I began to try to put this into some perspective. What does this mean financially for New England and for the state of Maine? And so I was able to locate the value of the timber industry at that time, which was estimated to be at $2.5 million in 1852. So therefore, our slave ship fleet was worth nearly 4 times more than our timber industry in the 1850s. Kitten interruptions, pardon me. Maine's involvement in slavery and the slave economies was deeply foundational to our region. And this little clip here in the middle is from a newspaper from the Portland Advertiser, and it states 3 of the slave vessels recently captured and taken into Havana are said to have been built with Boston and Portland capital. And when captured, Eastern people were on board as officers and part of crews. Another of the vessels had been owned by parties in Massachusetts, Maine, and New York, and was sold with the knowledge that she was intended for the slave trade. One had 460 Africans on board and another 116. Let not the slave oligarchy despair. So long as Northern men can be found to carry on the African slave trade, there will be no difficulty in keeping up a pro-slavery political party at the North under the stimulus of the spoils of office. So this is not an unusual article, and there are many, which I'll explain as I get a little further into the presentation, that implicate New Englanders in this horrific trafficking of human beings. And one of these people that was trafficking enslaved people was Rufus Soul. Soul was obviously, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Soul. Soul was a shipbuilder, a merchant from Freeport. He and his wife were very well-to-do. Soul was extremely prolific in his shipbuilding and his merchant activities, and of course also had an extended family network throughout the town of Freeport. So Soul, his entanglements with slavery come at a number of different levels. Firstly is his merchant activities of transporting cotton and sugar. And we tend to disassociate the reality of who created those things in the 19th century in particular, especially when we think about our merchant economy. And the reality is there was no cotton or sugar produced in the 19th century that was not produced by an enslaved person. So not in the United States, and certainly not in the Caribbean or Brazil. So enslaved people were the sole engines that were driving the Industrial Revolution in many ways, as well as the merchant economy of northern New England. On top of that, in my research, I have also discovered that Soul was involved in a number of other ways with slavery and the slave trade, as well as other activities that supported the removal of African Americans from the United States, freed African Americans from the United States. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But essentially, Rufus has a very complex historical entanglement with slavery. And I'm going to begin by talking about one vessel that was chartered by the American Colonization Society in the early 1850s. And I will pause here to briefly introduce what the American Colonization Society was. It was founded in 1816 by Robert Finley, and essentially it was an organization that encouraged the expatriation, so the emigration of African Americans outside of the United States, primarily back to Africa. And for the most part, Liberia, as well as Sierra Leone and some other colonies in Africa. But essentially, this organization, it was nationwide. There were many individual state level branches of this organization, including in Maine, but also New York, which you can see here, this image. But they, the organization was initially somewhat supported by free African Americans and others who supported the Back to Africa movements. And so there were a number of Black abolitionists and Black scholars and thinkers that thought there would be no way to establish a free society for African Americans in the United States without major changes to the way the country was running. And they did not see that the fact that slavery still existed here was something that was congruent with them being able to have freedom, have the freedom that they deserved. So many thought that they could found free Black republics in places like Liberia and go back to Africa. There was a emigration of a number of African Americans to Haiti as well, particularly after the successful Haitian Revolution, which really poised Haiti as this beacon of the first free Black republic, the first colony to successfully, overthrow their colonial ruler and end slavery through a massive slave rebellion. But essentially, by the 1830s, this becomes a way for white Americans to forcibly remove African Americans to Liberia. This is particularly the case after the Nat Turner Rebellion, where many states and enslavers who were in power in these states found that were very afraid of free African Americans, essentially inciting slave rebellions. They saw Haiti as an example of what could happen if there were too many free Black people around, educated free Black people around. And so they essentially began to pass numbers of different laws that barred the movement of free African Americans into different states. So many states did not allow free African Americans to move there. So they were not allowed to move about. They also barred slaveholders and slavers from manumitting or giving the freedom, giving freedom to their enslaved captives unless they agreed to provide for them in some way. And so either they would provide financial support for the rest of this person's life, or in many cases, they could just send them to Liberia, send them out of the United States. And so many enslavers, especially on larger plantations where there were, you know, dozens or hundreds of enslaved people living there in the South, that manumitted people upon the death of the enslaver, sent entire plantations of vessels to Liberia. So it became, the American Colonization Society becomes widely criticized by abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison by the 1830s, essentially saying this is racist. This is a way for white Americans to create a white republic, and yet it continued in popularity and was framed in many ways as this benevolent organization doing something good, but the reality was much, much different. The conditions aboard these vessels were the same as slave ships, essentially. These people were not transported like regular passengers. And so, you know, what I found is that there is a significant number of supporters of the American Colonization Society and the Maine Colonization Society in particular that are from Maine, including Rufus Soul, as well as, you know, other important men from Maine. George Patton of Bath was the treasurer of the Maine Colonization Society, and attempted to build a ship. They actually raised money to build a ship in the late 1850s, specifically to send free Black people back to Africa. And, you know, some of this is framed within the context of trying to stave off the Civil War. In a lot of cases, this was considered one of the ways that they could reach gradual emancipation. So the removal of formerly enslaved people from the United States. But in effect, what it did was forcibly relocate African Americans, freed African Americans, to different places in Africa. They did not have any connections to these places in terms of familial connections. In most cases, they did not have, you know, any relationships to any of these people. And of course, they were from America. So when they get to Africa, they are encountering all of these diseases that they have never encountered before, as well as, you know, they do not have some of the resistances that people have to, you know, common illnesses in Africa that in the people from the United States. So the mortality rate in many of these African colonies, particularly, you know, prior to inoculations being more widely available in the later 19th century, was extremely high. So many people just drop dead of disease, malnutrition, you know, exposure, all these different things once they arrived in Haiti. So one vessel that did this, that participated in the American colonization movement, was a bark named the Chieftain that was built and owned by Rufus, which transported free African Americans to Liberia in 1850 on behalf of the American Colonization Society. And they transported 164 formerly enslaved people that were owned by Jacob Wood of Savannah to Liberia. And you see the list here on the left right hand side rather of the various people. And I thought the end of this list was really poignant, where the author is saying that I believe that all of these people were born as slaves, unless that Native Africans were not. We do not know whether they have any friends in Liberia. They may be slightly acquainted with some of the immigrants from Savannah. William Goldman can read and write, but we do not know of any other case. So this is a significant, moment for these people, where they are being forcibly moved to Liberia, forced to go on this middle passage, and you see the ages of many of these people are little children, 1-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 7-year-old, people of all ages, and of, who knows what happened to them once they arrived in Liberia. But it's important to note here as well that the society had already, by this year in 1850, had transported 7,000 formerly enslaved people, free African Americans, to Liberia. So, and that increased a lot in the 1850s. So the Chieftain was captained by a man named Frederick Drinkwater, who was from Portland, and who goes on to become probably the most notorious American organizer of slave ship journeys in the 1850s, captaining or acting as false registered owner of at least a dozen slave ships, and was solely responsible for the transportation of thousands of enslaved people to Cuba alone. So the Chieftain returns from this journey, where it delivered enslaved people to Africa in January of 1851 by way of Havana, with no cargo and loaded with Spanish doubloons and silver. And so you see here they have thousands of doubloons of gold and silver on board the vessel. What is likely that happened is that the vessel purchased enslaved people after it dropped the folks off in Liberia. And this also happened with at least one other Maine ship around the same time period, the Rebecca, which was from Brunswick, which was owned by Joseph Badger. But essentially, it was getting very difficult. The reason why they chose to do this was it was getting very difficult for American ships to get clearance to go to Africa, because of the increasing pressure of primarily Great Britain on the United States to finally crack down on Americans participating in the slave trade. Now, this doesn't really happen until 1862, and the slave trade increases dramatically in the 19th century, in the 1850s, to Cuba. But essentially what this means is, what's likely to have happened, the fact that this vessel arrived with no cargo coming from Havana, not even sugar or anything, just gold, it certainly wouldn't have made that much gold, nor would have been gone for the months that it was gone, like 9-10 months that it was gone, unless it was up to something else. And so very likely, especially given the fact what happens with Drinkwater, which we'll talk about a little bit, that this journey was a slave trading journey on the back end. So they purchased enslaved people in Africa, took them to Cuba, successfully sold them, and then arrived back in New York with an empty hull. So other vessels that were engaged in the foreign slave trade at this time also includes the Rufus Soul, Rufus's namesake. This brigantine was built in Freeport. It was built in 1844, I believe, in Freeport, and at this point in the late 1850s, it is regularly traveling along the coast of the United States, primarily doing transportation between the upper South and the lower South, so like Baltimore and New Orleans, as well as going to the Caribbean frequently, going to Cuba, other places in the Caribbean, St. Croix, places like that, and up to big question mark activities until this happens. So in 1858, it clears from New Orleans for Cuba, and it is sighted in October. So before it cleared for Cuba, I should back up a little bit. It was consigned by a man named Cristobal Valdez for about $5,000, which was a huge amount of money. So like an average vessel of this size, especially of this age, was getting on in years, would have been, probably 2,000, something like that, $3,000 to consign it. This is a large amount of money. So it immediately throws up suspicions, particularly since Valdez is a well-known entity in the port of Matanzas, where the vessel was departing from to go to Africa. So the British consul, having seen what's happening, seen who has consigned this vessel, talks to the American consul in Matanzas and says, this vessel is suspicious. You should not allow it to go to Africa. But the Americans did nothing to stop it. So the vessel departs from Matanzas and ends up off of Cabinda, Angola in October of 1858, where it is sighted with another vessel from Maine, the schooner Kate Ellen of Portland, both of which are about ready to take on enslaved people. And so the British captain of the vessel called the Viper, which is a really catchy name for a vessel that is looking for slave ships. The Viper sends officers to board both vessels, and upon arriving on the vessels, they find a slave deck built on both vessels. They find coppers and irons. They find cookers. They find casks of water, lots and lots of water, which is generally a large sign that they are about to participate in the slave trade. If there's a large amount of water rather than rum or anything else that they could potentially trade, it means they're going to take on a large number of people. So the captain of the Viper decides to burn the vessel, and they remove the captain of the ship, a man named Anderson, and bomb it with cannon fire until it sinks off of the coast of Cabinda. And what follows is quite an intense moment between the United States and Great Britain about whether or not the British actually had a right to do this. And it's very interesting to see it's quite easy if you Google this. This is primarily from newspapers, as well as parliamentary papers from Great Britain. But essentially, there is a moment where Great Britain is saying, we had all this evidence. This is obviously a slave ship. We're within our rights to burn it per our treaty. And the Americans are saying there weren't any enslaved people on board. How dare you? This is an affront to our liberty. The American flag was flying when this was happening. And then the British come back and say, well, we watched the captain literally throw the cabinet that had his papers in it overboard as we approached the vessel to hide what he was doing. I mean, this is insanely suspicious. There's all of this essentially circumstantial evidence, although the slave deck is pretty substantial evidence that they were participating in the slave trade. And so this becomes quite an aggressive moment back and forth between the two countries. And eventually it is settled that nothing is going to really happen out of this. The vessel is sunk, and the owners can collect insurance money, which they do. And nobody is brought up on charges. Nobody faces any penalties as a result of this. And so, that's just two of the major ways in which, Soul himself was engaged in the foreign slave trade. He and his cousins, the other members of the Soul family, were also engaged with the domestic American slave trade. And so what you're seeing on the screen here are a number of slave ship manifests. These are documents. Manifests are essentially documents that recorded lawful cargo as it entered and exited different ports in the United States primarily. And these manifests are incredible documents that, especially these slave ship manifests, because they are in many cases the only evidence we have of an enslaved person's name or anything about them, and where they came from, and that's really the only picture we have into their lives. But unfortunately, we've lost many manifests in different cataclysmic events in the United States. So the Boston manifests are gone. They were lost in a fire and a flood, and Portland manifests obviously went down with the Custom House. So we have just a picture of one end of this story. So these manifests primarily are from vessels entering New Orleans or departing from Charleston. And so what you're seeing here on the left-hand side of the screen, this manifest is for the brig Venus, which was captained by Francis Soul, which was owned by Rufus, which transported a 15-year-old girl named Mary from Charleston to New Orleans in 1845. So this is just the evidence of one person we have for this vessel, but given the issues with condition and also the fact that these have not been fully digitized and are fully accessible, a lot of them are scattered throughout different National Archives locations. This is the one I've been able to find for this vessel. So there's likely more people that were transported as part of regular, essentially they were passengers to captive passengers that were transported along with other coastwise merchant goods. So cotton, bringing rum from New England and bringing it down to trade for cotton and sell, and, lumber and fish and all those sorts of things that they would regularly transport. They would also often take on enslaved people. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see one manifest for 25-year-old Caroline and her 6- and 1-year-old children, Harry and Godfrey, who were sold along with her on board the brigantine Susan Soul in 1848. And along with them, other enslaved people were shipped at the same time, a man named Porter, a man named Robert, Page, and Clark. So we know, at least on this vessel at this journey in 1848, at least 7 enslaved people were transported during this journey. So, with more research, with more deep diving into archival collections on the back end, where merchants would likely have been keeping track of this was legal activity. Unlike the foreign slave trade, we don't have evidence like this. We don't have a manifest because it was illegal, so they were not filing a manifest for this. But we do have that for the domestic American slave trade, and we can understand a little bit more about how our region was complicit in these different activities. And so, this is a very basic spreadsheet that I've been working on that captures these different vessels. And this number, actually, I have added some recently. So now I am up to approximately 20,000 captive Africans that were embarked in Africa by Maine slave ships just between the years of 1848 and 1862. So that's a significant number of people that were transported by Maine vessels, by Maine captains and crews, as well as people from across New England. So there is also a large number of people from Massachusetts and other states that were involved in this activity. But it shows you how deeply important it was to our merchant economy, and also that it had a massive human toll and a massive outcome for people of African descent, both in these locations such as Cuba, as well as for the lived experience for people at home. Because if people thought slavery was okay elsewhere, even if they were expressing abolitionist views, they did not necessarily believe in the equality of people of African descent, or the fact that they didn't necessarily even believe that slavery outside of the United States was wrong. So people hold a lot of these conflicting views. I think we see it a lot today too, where things contradict each other. But Mainers were not separate from this at all. And so I'll close out tonight just talking about Frederick Drinkwater just briefly. Drinkwater was born on August 3rd, 1817 in Portland. He was the son of ship captain David Drinkwater Jr., he was part of the Drinkwater family of Yarmouth. The Drinkwaters were wealthy, they were connected, maritime men and ship captains. So Frederick married Jane B. Milliken, who was the daughter of Frederick's father's business partner at the Bank of Cumberland. His name was Weston Milliken. They married in 1842 and settled into a home on Cumberland Avenue in Munjoy Hill. By 1850, Frederick becomes deeply involved in the slave trade to Cuba, working on behalf of Maine merchants and ship owners. The first vessel that he captained under suspicious circumstances was the bark Chieftain. The bark was consigned by the American Colonization Society again, and made at least 3 trips on behalf of the American Colonization Society between 1850 and 1853, transporting upwards of at least 500 people to Liberia, whether they wanted to go or not. And it was implicated, the Chieftain goes on to be implicated in slave trading in 1852. Yet Drinkwater, essentially, I think in this early trip in 1850, makes a lot of connections in Cuba, especially, and Liberia, and becomes a favorite captain for the recruitment of New England slave ships for the Cuban slave trade in the 1850s. So between 1850 and 1860, he was the registered captain of the following ships: the Chieftain, the Susan Soul, which was also implicated in the foreign slave trade after in 1851, after the journey transporting enslaved African Americans in 1848. The Florina in 1852, the Gambia in 1854, the Cosmopolitan in 1855, the Minnetonka in 1857, the Joseph Record in 1857, the R.B. Lawton, the Niagara, the Brahmin, the Abbott Devereux, and finally the Minnetonka. So he alone was responsible for the transportation of an unknown number of, likely thousands of enslaved people to Cuba during the 1850s. He was also the captain of several other vessels that were acting suspiciously during the 1840s and early 1850s, including several which were struck by devastating yellow fever outbreaks, which was a likely sign of being engaged in the slave trade. By 1857, he actually relocated partially to Havana, and he was working directly with Spanish and Portuguese slave traders that were operating between New York, Boston, and Havana, as well as other cities in Cuba. Drinkwater's activities were so blatant and unchecked that despite the knowledge of this, I mean, you see this quote here on the left from the Consul General to the Earl of Clarendon, who was an earl in Great Britain. He didn't suffer any consequences. He died peacefully at home of liver cancer when he was in his 70s. And so I think, I'm going to wrap up now and open up to questions. But, I think we can begin to better understand our complicity with global slavery, as well as, the participation of people directly in the slave trade by re-examining our historical collections and, rethinking how we have identified as a region as an abolitionist place. Is that really accurate? I'm of the opinion that slavery is all around us in the built environment in Maine. It's just hidden in different ways that we don't recognize it the same way as a plantation house. But if we begin to reevaluate and rethink about how people made their money, we begin to see that slavery truly is all around us, and we live with its afterlives every day in our present. So with that, I will stop sharing and open it up for questions.
So thank you so much, Kate, and thank you all again for joining us. There are a few ways to do questions. If you would like to turn your audio and or video on and ask your question directly, feel free. Just keep in mind we are recording this, so you will be recorded. If you'd rather put your question in the chat, I'm happy to read it for you, and we will get some answers from Kate. Judy, did you have a question? Judy, I'm not sure if you're speaking, but you're muted still.
Well, I think Judy sent me a direct message asking
okay, great.
If the Viper was Rufus Soul's ship. So the Viper actually was a British naval vessel. So it was owned by the British Navy. It was part of the Africa Squadron, which was a group of ships that was specifically patrolling the coast of Africa, looking for Americans as well as British citizens that were engaged in the slave trade, so people breaking these laws. There was also a set of American vessels that were there at the same time period that were also patrolling, and they were also in Brazil and different parts of the Caribbean. But primarily, the British were had been, directing naval forces towards this the longest. The Americans didn't really start to specifically direct naval forces to finding people engaging this in traffic until the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which incidentally also resolved the northern border of Maine. Was the end of the Aristic War is the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. So it did that. It also made the United States commit to building vessels specifically to find Americans participating in the slave trade. And it also resolved a different slave ship situation called the Creole, where enslaved people rose up on board and sailed the vessel to Bermuda and were successfully emancipated by the British Crown. So essentially, the Viper is a British Navy vessel. The vessel that Soul owned was the Venus. That was the one that I was talking about in that section around the domestic slave trade. Ingrid, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I guess I just have a few comments, and it really strikes me that the British became the conscience of like US slavery, or the enforcers in some way, considering our history with, the French and the English colonial project here. And they're burning it down, our slaving vessel. It just really reminded me of that right after the George Floyd, that burning it down of the police station. So this kind of like mass mobilization that sort of comes up periodically. And, I'm just really interested in also the rebellion stories and the, the ways that there's always been success against the colonial project.
Yeah, I didn't have enough time to get into it today, but I've talked about in a couple of my other talks that there was massive resistance by enslaved people on board slave ships. So on average, 1 in 10 vessels experienced a revolt on board during the Middle Passage. I think that number is probably much higher. They just were not reported, or they were smaller acts of resistance, or they, the vast majority of them were not successful in terms of turning the vessel around. Only a few vessels really, a few groups of people were successful in doing that. But at the beginning of the talk, I shared an image of a ship called the Kentucky, and that vessel was implicated in the slave trade to Rio de Janeiro in the 1840s. And that vessel had a significant uprising on board it off of the coast of Mozambique. And I talk about that in a talk I gave with Pejepscot Historical Society. So you can Google me and Google Pejepscot, you can probably find it. But essentially, yes, resistance is such a key element to this, and Africans resisted in so many different ways on board the vessel, and also, by organizing active resistance and anti-slavery actions against the slave trade and, of course, slavery as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really interesting, like small pop culture thing. Have you read Slave Dancer?
Mm-mm.
A young adult novel, and it's actually totally fascinating, and it kind of connects into some stuff. I totally recommend it to you as an aside of a kind of neat like piece of popular culture that sort of like got put away because it's not necessarily, it kind of it writes it from the perspective of a boy who is kidnapped onto one of these slave ships that's operating illegally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll have to check it out. Thank you for the
Thanks, Ingrid. I want to get to a couple more questions. First, Kathleen had a quick question, which is regarding the ship that is behind me. That is a Soul-built ship. It's the Tam O'Shanter. It is the painting was done when it was in Hong Kong, but that is one of many remnants of various soul ships that we have here at the Freeport Historical Society. Sam had a question for you, Kate, about the ships going back to Liberia, allegedly taking folks back, enslaved people or freed enslaved people back, and what is to verify that they actually went to Liberia versus being returned to slavery somewhere else?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do have, thankfully on that end, I have evidence of them arriving. So they are reported in the local newspapers in Liberia as having arrived. So there were, a number of colonial African journals that reported directly back from Liberia to the United States. So we do know that those people actually arrived. With the Rebecca, which I briefly mentioned, that vessel is interesting because they were trying to actually sell those people, those freed people, the enslaved people, African Americans had been freed from New Orleans from a planter there. And the captain initially was going to actually transport them to Cuba to sell them in Cuba. But the ship surgeon protested and put up a stink and essentially said, I will report you to authorities if you do this. And so they did successfully land in Liberia, but then the surgeon, so we have actually a journal that was written by the surgeon about this whole experience. After they leave Liberia, they sail down the coast to the Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, and purchase enslaved people there, and then return and go to Cuba. So many of these American Colonization Society ships, this is certainly an area that needs more research, what were the outcomes of these journeys? Did the people actually land there? The Rebecca and the Chieftain are the two where I know directly that after going to Liberia, they purchased enslaved people once they were there. And they really did this to, because of all of this pressure from the British and as well as American authorities in the ports, they did this to skirt around the laws of clearances and things like that.
Kate, Kathleen had another comment, and thank you for the in-depth research that you've done into not just Freeport, but Maine in particular within New England, and particularly the call out about comparing the slave economic impact versus the timber industry, just for that point of comparison, and looking at these ship captain homes that we see up and down the Maine coast. And really looking at those almost as plantation homes now. And I think we've all known for some time that a lot of the wealth that came through the shipping industry all over New England, certainly in Rhode Island and southern New England states, but more and more we recognize that also had an impact here in Maine. And you referenced that in terms of those afterlives of the slave economy being all around us here. And how do we reconcile that, or what do we do about that? One of the folks that I would like to introduce briefly, because I know we are nearing the end of our time, is Meadow Dibble, who is here on the screen with us. Meadow is actually going to be presenting our next Thursday program. It's not going to be in the month of November, but it's going to be in early December. We have been doing the last Thursday of the month. We decided not to do the last Thursday of November, but on December 2nd, Meadow is going to be with us presenting on her project and her organization, Atlantic Black Box. And I'll let Meadow say a little bit more about that presentation, but it really does address one of the things that Kathleen is commenting about, and not only about doing the research, but also what do we do then with the knowledge that we uncover as we can reconstruct those histories. Meadow, would you like to say just a few words about what you have coming up for us?
Thanks so much, Eric. And thank you, Kate. I don't know how many of your talks I've been to at this point. I try to catch every single one, and I learn so much every time. And thank you, Kathleen, for your question and your beautiful, very personal narrative about what it has been for you to realize that you were living in a soul home without knowing any of this history. I think Atlantic Black Box as a project is really asking people in the community, whether they are scholars like Kate or people like Kathleen, who happen to find themselves in the midst of a past that is not past, a past that is very present. And has a big impact on us as human beings today. Atlantic Black Box is looking to engage people throughout Maine, throughout the region of New England, in doing this research, picking up a shovel wherever you are and beginning to dig and asking some basic questions, and then sharing our findings. And doing this thanks to the guidance of scholars like Kate and many more who are part of our network. So I really look forward to talking with you all about that. When I'm back in December, I want to thank you, Eric, for the invitation. Thank also Jewel Gordeau, who was a dear friend on Cape Cod and then a Colby College alum alongside me, for helping to introduce the Atlantic Black Box Project and Kate McMahon's scholarship here in Freeport. This is what we believe in. It's about connecting with communities and asking some tough questions, but doing it together, and then trying to make sense of what it means for us now in the present. We can do this. We can go there together. So thanks. And I look forward to coming back and talking with you all again soon.
Thanks so much, Meadow. And I want to thank you all again for joining us. Kate has really given us a great starting point and context to move forward into our next event with Meadow and our continuing work with Atlantic Black Box. Kathleen mentioned how do we reconcile this, and how do we tell this as the Freeport Historical Society, not just about any one ship that was built in the shipyards in South Freeport, but a lot of the names that are part of our history and are very familiar to us. You may have recognized some of those other names in Kate's presentation. You may have seen Nathan Nye's name on that list of members of the American Colonization Society. There are other things that we have learned about other familiar names like Barnabas Henry Bartol, and other folks that have really come to be iconic names within the town of Freeport. And the first step is to really understand this part of the history that we have not really dealt with before we can really find out that question about what do we do next and how do we retell those stories. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you especially to Kate for doing her second presentation of the evening for us here. And I look forward to having you all back for the next event with Meadow on December 2nd. Meadow, did you have one more thing to say? Oh, sorry, a hand go up.
I was clapping.
Oh, okay. I thought that was a raised hand, but it was a clapping emoji. Thank you all so much. This event, as I mentioned before, it was recorded. We will have that posted on our website and our Facebook page. So if you know folks that missed it, or you think of folks that should have been here, we hope you'll share that link with them. So good evening, and thank you all again.